There's also a huge, huge labor shortage, right? The trades are in such high demand, it's unreal.
Engineering mindset, learns a skill with AI, he might have his own vertically integrated general contracting business with an overhead of two people, and he's doing 500 million like a year. Like there's just a lot of opportunities now.
There's robots that drive around now drilling anchors in the deck if you give it the right, some of the dusty robotics and the layout equipment and all of this stuff. We are starting to see it in the field, and it's pretty awesome.
What did you learn maybe just through building in that kind of chaos? Well, Wes Juergens, how you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. So I don't know if you know this, but you kicked off this podcast, Wes. You were the first guest I ever had.
I did not know. I didn't know I was a first. I remember doing it. It was very early, but I
I
did
think
not
I
know that it was the first.
I think I tried to hold that from you, so you didn't think it was a really small podcast, but it was. And
What do we have? Seven people listen to it or something?
maybe, and they were all with the last name Poppy.
Right.
Um, but hey, man, it's good to have you back. You're in a little bit of a different setting. You were in a vehicle. I think the last time we chatted.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm taking it from my home office right now.
There we go. So, maybe just to jump into it, one of the things we talked about, at the time, you were a superintendent working at a University of Houston job,
Hmm.
and in one of our pre-conversations, you talked about resisting the move to being in a more regional role. What was the moment or the conversation that maybe finally you stopped fighting and just kind of embraced what your career had for you?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I was never resisting the role. I think I was more prone to say, I don't know if I'm quite ready, right? And I've always been fairly hard on myself. I think that I always think I'm like one step away. I constantly live with like a little bit of anxiety that like we're not going to make it. I think this is why I've also been a good superintendent. I'm always anxious, right? It's never
Yeah,
fast
yeah.
enough. Yeah, but it was one of those that I have a really good boss. He's been my mentor for a while. He's a fantastic guy, and he's one of those that goes, you don't understand how resourceful you are, how intelligent you are, how good you are at your job, right? And so just coaching and encouragement,
Yeah.
and kind of taking that leap, and I was excited about it. I wanted it. It was just I was kind of like, man, really? You think now? So
Man, I think that's really important. Just having that little nudge, a little bit of someone in your corner. I think my version of that was at some point in my career, I had a mentor just say like, "Hey, like you're kind of overthinking it. Just trust your gut." And in previous conversations on the podcast, we've talked about how you get to the point where you can trust your gut, and there's a little bit of experience, a little bit of failure that gets you there. But I think one of the things I've always liked about you is I think the spectrum of leadership in construction is often command and control or maybe the lack of like a leadership presence, and there's not a ton of kind of nuance in the middle, and I think you bring a lot of that nuance, which is you bring credibility, but also you're willing to listen and you're willing to try new things. So in one of our conversations you mentioned wanting to show your guys kind of their own way of being effective and not necessarily your way. And I think that's a pretty mature distinction. How did you land on that? And maybe what did it cost you in terms of hey, this could have just been easier if we'd have just done it my way?
yeah, no, I mean, I got put in a position now where I'm overseeing multiple projects, right? And so that level of effectiveness that I had in the field as the job site superintendent running the day to day took a drastic change when it was like, hey, Wes, here's four, five, six projects. Now the good thing is that the on most all of those, the superintendents that are now running those, most of those guys used to work with me. So that already helped, right? That there was already a bit of relationship. But I've got a couple where it's a new team that we didn't have a relationship with prior, and it's not so much about don't do it my way or do it my way. I think that's really related to what the task is. When it comes to like the nuts and bolts things that are rigid and have requirements about hey, this is how I want meeting minutes to be in our trade partner meetings. Hey, this is how I want schedule updates to be. Those are all you have to do it my way, right? Um, it's more around management style and leadership style, and I had several guys that again came up with me. And the ones that were with me for a long time didn't struggle with this, but the ones that were with me for a short period were like, man, I'm gonna do it just like Wes. I'm gonna act like Wes, I'm gonna talk like Wes, I'm gonna lose my temper when Wes will lose his temper. I'm not gonna do it when Wes would, and it didn't work, and it was very noticeable. I don't want to say that it came out fake, but maybe that's what it was, right? And I told some of the guys, like after a meeting or something, and the way they would handle a situation, I go, "Hey, dude, don't try to do it like me. Do it the way that you think is the best way." Um, so that's been a little bit of a leadership change, and just not being the guy that's in the weeds all the time, right? I think that's probably the hardest thing that I've had to adjust to is that what made me a good superintendent, and I think I was a good superintendent, is that I knew every detail of the job, right? And I think that's an important thing is that anal retentiveness, micromanaging, like I was mentioning earlier, anxiety, like those are things that actually are great qualities in a superintendent because they run a disciplined, organized job. And now when I walk into a project or a client calls me and goes, "Hey man, over here at XYZ project, I think the team's struggling with," and I got to go do hours of research to know what the challenge is when before, I knew it like the back of my hand.
All right, sponsor break. Lars, real quick. When was the last time you got a new set of drawings from an architect and they didn't cloud anything?
Well, the one that cost me a couple $100,000 was back, I think, in 2017. So, yeah, lesson learned there.
Yeah, so what I like about what Trick Tools is building is they're looking at tools to help kind of remove the mundane from the job site. And I same as you. Every time there was a bulletin or an addendum, I would go back to the designers and ask them to at least highlight or give me a cover letter on the changes. And that was always like pulling like teeth. But Trunk Tools is now automating that. So you get a bulletin come in, it automatically highlights the changes. You don't have to do a thing.
Well, it's also hitting RFIs, right? It's also hitting submittals. And when we think about standardizing ops, right, and providing that, sort of resource to those field operators, what I see it as, it's sort of like this like mentor within the company that structures, standardizes, keeps it moving in the right direction, looks out for risk. And just this last week, I had a QC manager just pass along a submittal to an owner without doing a review because he was too busy and it was wrong. And the classic owner statement is, "Did you even review this?" Right? So this to me is carte blanche. We absolutely did. And think about getting that first pass before your field manager ever even actually has to do the first pass. Someone's doing it for them. So to me, it's about speed. It increases accuracy and helps standardize ops out in the field. Right?
Yeah, and this is the kind of AI that we've talked about on the
Yep.
podcast, really appreciating, right? Which is looking at ways to elevate the craftsman at the heart of project delivery.
Give me time back so I can be out in the field managing risk. Right?
Yeah, one hundred
Yep.
percent. So, all right, if you're a little curious, check it out, trunktools.com/podcast. And if you mention construction conversations, you get a discount. Do it.
Discount demos are free, and and you guys get a discount. So let's
That's
go.
right. So high blood pressure is maybe a, passive indicator of a superintendent's quality.
A hundred
What?
percent, 100%. The great ones are always on a little edge, right?
So for the superintendents who are listening, who are really good at running their own job, and maybe in a similar role or position of like on the crest of that next kind of promotion to more of a regional role, what's the hardest habit to break when you stop being kind of the person in the field every day?
Micromanaging
Yeah.
it is probably the hardest one, and what it boils down to is if you try to keep that same level of attentiveness and detail that you had when you were running one job, you're gonna you're going to work yourself to death, right? You're going to become so stressed out because you can't keep up with all of it. And I say that, right? There's different ways. It's maybe you're overseeing multiple medium sized projects, or maybe you're just on one ginormous project where you've got 20 or 30 superintendents underneath
Yep.
you in different areas of the building, right? Those are kind of the same thing, but
Yep.
um, it's you gotta. And I think the biggest thing to learn is when do you let somebody fail,
Mm.
right? All the lessons that I know really well, I know them because I screwed it up at one point, right?
Mm.
And I'm kind of a hard headed person, and that's how I learn is about making those mistakes. So at some point, you kind of got to sit back and go, man, I'm going to let Bob do that, and then but then you also got to know when it's like, hey, this could end badly, right? If it's a safety thing, obviously it's a non-starter, right? You don't
Right.
ever let that go. But if it's one of those coordination issues where it's like, yep, I told you, you probably should have ran those roof drains first. You probably should have had the downspouts tied in, or you waited too long to start your underground, and now you got a water infiltration problem, or whatever it is, right? So.
Are you seeing, there's a big conversation in the space around how AI and different technologies are a kind of cutting off the bottom rungs of the ladder around entry level roles. And when we talk about, leadership, we ultimately kind of start with our own failures and experiences in these kind of entry level roles. I think it's a while until that really manifests itself in construction. Um, but there is an element of that problem showing up in the way in which maybe an over reliance on some of this tech is inhibiting people from learning some of the lessons that they need to be learning. Have you started to see that manifest itself in the field at all?
It could be. Here's a good example on that. Let's talk about layout and field engineers and total stations for
Mm.
a minute, right? 20 years ago plus, you were still going up on the deck early in the morning before anybody else was up there, so it wasn't shaking, and you were carrying control vertically up the building and setting, popping string lines across the deck, right? And now everybody's walking around with a Tremel, or you got a robotic total station, and so field engineers, and I'm not. This is not derogatory towards field. I love
Yeah.
my field engineers, and I've got good ones. But for the new ones that are coming up, guys that just got into layout in the last 10 years, they probably learned on a robotic total station or a Tremel or something like that. Very few of them have even had the opportunity to know what it's like to turn an angle and pull a chain.
Hmm.
And so that's one of those where you got to kind of recognize, are we losing too much of the fundamentals, and where is that fine line, and I don't know. I don't know if I'm on the right track, if that's actually a problem. It's the same question around. I've got young kids, right? They're 14 and 10, but
Mm.
they're learning long division, and stuff like that in math, and it's like, why do I got a calculator? It's 2026. When am I ever not going to have a calculator? It's like, I
Yeah.
don't know. But you still got to learn it, right? So.
Well, at some point, like we have to put value in the matter in our brains, right? Like I think we've been on this kind of path of outsourcing things that can kind of grow what we can do and what we're capable of. But at some point, if intelligence itself is outsourced, we start to question like, okay, what is our role? And I do think we're at this point where the analog does really matter because without the exercising of that brain, it's going to atrophy like any other muscle. And so, yeah, I think it's a relevant point. So, if you've had a career in construction in any variety, you've been thrown into a difficult job. And, from a leadership standpoint, I think there's a lot of different ways to approach that. There's the tactics, there's the strategy, there's the culture. When you get dropped into a difficult project, what's your kind of go to? What does that look like for you?
Right out of the gate, it's culture. What is the pulse of the team? What is the culture of the GC's team? What is the
Mm.
culture of the owner, architect, contractor team? What is the culture of the trade partners on the job site? And it's kind of like, is that where the problem is, right? So if a project is having troubles, what are the troubles around? Is it
Mm.
is it QC issues? Is it safety issues? Are they behind schedule? Is it a budget problem? And then obviously you're going to focus in on what that is, but then, well, why is there a QC issue? Why is there a safety issue? Is
Yeah.
there a challenge on the job site with the safety culture, and how do you address that? And that's tough. That's That's if you're behind schedule, you can build a recovery schedule, right? And it's not as easy as that because you got to get everybody's buy-in, right? You got to actually have the plan, and you got to get everybody's buy-in for it. And of course, there's going to be financial implications that come from that, but you can build that, right? But when there's a culture issue on the job, how do you address it? So that's the tough one.
Well, Wes, that's the tough question back to you. How how do you fix culture?
It's getting everybody on board, and sometimes you'll find out like, hey, maybe there's a couple of problem people on the job, right? Maybe
Yeah.
there's a couple of foremen out there that just don't need to be there. If you got conflicting personalities, how do you fix that? Is it
Hmm.
because one of them is just flat out of line, and that person needs to be removed from the project? That happens sometimes. Is it just, hey, maybe we need to make a change, maybe we need to move them to another area of the building? And the big deal is that, look, the general contractor is the leader on the job, so what
Hmm.
kind of example are they setting? In my background is I've been a GC for 20 years now. And I'm pretty hard on my guys. I'm pretty hard on my superintendents, right? So if an owner calls me and says, "Hey, man, we got a quality issue on the job. Y'all are failing inspections left and right. So okay, great. First thing I want to do is tell my superintendents, copy me on your inspection request, and I'm going to show up the morning of and see what does it look like." And it goes, "Guys, are you kidding me? Did y'all even do y'all's job? Have we pre-punched the areas before so are we doing our job as the GC and setting the example? If we're not doing that, then our trade partners aren't going to do it either."
Yeah.
As simple as that. And same thing with safety. Why do we have so many people having, injuries on this project? Well, why are there constant deficiencies in safety? Are we not leading by example? And everybody's going to type 2 hard hats now with and so if the superintendent's walking around and his straps undone, and his vest is unzipped, and like he's swinging his safety glasses in his hands, he doesn't want to wear them, and it's like, hey, you're setting the example right there. I was
Yeah.
walking a job a while back, and it was funny. I didn't have my gloves on, and it was like one of the just a plain laborer out there with a shovel on his hands, and he turned around and looked at me. He goes, "Hey, you need to put your gloves on." And like the
That'll
couple of
work.
guys that I were with, like, gave him this look like, "You know who you're talking to?" And I was like, "Shoot, thank you, man, I appreciate it,
Yeah.
absolutely." And then
Yeah.
I recognized him in the next job white safety meeting. I said, "This guy wasn't afraid to tell anybody."
That's
And
great.
so that's a good culture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you're saying, which is I think so often we think of the GC role through the tactics of like, and distribution of information. GCs carry risk. They're a communication hub, but I think driving leadership. I think that's a big component of it, and I think it often is not as focused on as it should be. So that's a great point. Um, in terms of the problem projects, maybe if we talk about and switch kind of gears to how do we not get to the point where you're having to kind of Hail Mary a job? What are some of the ways you approach a new job?
Setting the tempo is the biggest thing, and so it, for project managers, it's discipline and being organized. Are your contracts squared away before they go out the door? Are we being organized? Do we already have our submittal log put together? All that kind of stuff. On the field side, it's pushing the job. It's setting up from day one. What does your trailer look like, right? What does your trailer complex look like? So I use this example when I'm talking to my superintendents is when a new trade partner comes on board, and the craft workers show up for day one for orientation. Do they know where to go?
Hmm.
Are there signs on the gate? What does it look like to get from the gate to the job trailer? When they walk in the job trailer, where's the orientation room at? If we say orientation's at 7 a.m., then I expect at 6:55, whoever's delivering orientation is standing in there with his computer set up and ready to go. If the guys are standing around the trailer for 30 minutes going, asking like every PE that walks by, like, "Hey, man, when is orientation?" Like, you've already told them that you don't have any discipline. Same thing when they walk into the field. If I'm telling the tile guy that we're ready to start tile, right?
Yeah.
Then that means that the bathrooms are swept clean. There's no material stored in them. Walls are obviously hung out and done. Joints have been bedded, everything else. My field engineer's already popped center line chalk marks on the floor, and when he walks in, he goes, oh man, they really are ready for me, right?
Hmm.
So it's setting that tempo right out of the gate. And then same thing with schedule. When we're driving a schedule is one of the hardest things to maintain on the project for a superintendent is, and it's what are we doing when we miss dates? And so number one is where did we get the information from? Were we collaborative? Did we ask our trade partners for their input on the schedule, or did we just say this is what it is and y'all all better meet it?
Hmm.
So what do your pool planning sessions look like? What do your trade partner meetings look like? Are you getting feedback from those guys? Are you open to getting feedback is the other one, right? I mean, I've got some superintendents that their sub meeting might be 30 minutes long and it's 30 minutes of them just yelling at everybody. This is what we're doing. And nobody says anything. And it's like, well, that's
Yep.
not very effective.
Right.
Um, you go through it and you go, hey, look, we're going to start framing Area C this week. We're starting on Tuesday and I'm showing it next Friday working. Please, everybody good with that? When he goes, well, not really, Wes. I don't think we're going to be ready. And we still haven't finished priority walls. And okay, well, what do we need to do to finish that? Hey, duck guy, when you bring in duck, that's a collaborative meeting. And then when you get that going, and then next week you go, hey, remember you're supposed to be done Friday. And he goes, that ain't going to happen. Well, sorry, why not? That's not going to work. This guy's coming right behind you.
Hmm.
This material's getting unloaded tomorrow, holding people accountable. So,
Man.
it's setting that tempo right out of the gate of
Well,
what
and I
goes into
think,
the
and when you talk it through, it all seems so basic, right? But we've all been on projects where that is not the majority experience that we've had, and I think leadership is the difference. What is do you have a go-to kind of scheduling methodology? Are you a tact guy, last planner, basic CPM?
Yeah, I still build, with sticky notes on the conference room wall when we're in pre-construction and just kind of looking at what direction we're going to head, and then I start, I do it I got a marker board wall where the whole wall is writable, right, and then I can start drawing my arrows and we can move everything around, and but I grab the major players, and the good thing is that even if we haven't bid a job yet officially. I mean, I've got some trade partners that I have really good relationships with that I can call on for advice and say, hey, man, I've never done a forming system like this. What do you think our production rates are? And kind of start with that. But then the biggest one is once you get rolling, and we've got our own policies. Hey, within 7 days of an NTP to a trade partner, they got to submit their schedule back to me, and then I review their schedule and make sure it's in line with the baseline schedule that we put in their subcontract. And then if it's not, well, why not? How do we address that? And then creating those collaborative rooms. I've been in those situations before where I go, okay, we're going to pull plan finishes, right? So sheetrock is hung, and now we're taping and floating, and we're putting in tile, and we're trimming out fixtures, and we're trimming out electrical, and we're bringing in millwork, and I want to kind of pull plan those activities on a fragnet. So I get all those guys in a room. First things first is you got to show up with a plan. So I already have a schedule in mind. And I say, guys, here's what I've got. And I look at a plumber and I go, you got 3 days to set fixtures in area B. Does that work? And in those meetings, everybody just kind of does the bobblehead, right? And everybody sit in the back of the room and you got to make them talk, right? And so that's when I point at him and go, David, I said, you got 3 days. Can you do it in three? And finally he goes, well, not really. I think I need four. Okay, well, let's add four to it and see what it does. Well, if I do that, now I got to get the door guy started. So are you good with having or whatever it happens to be? But if you got a meeting where nobody's participating, there's two things. Either you're not letting them participate or encouraging them to, or you got the wrong people in the room, right? Uh, so sometimes you'll have a foreman from one of your trade partners that he's not comfortable making those decisions, and he's just going to sit there and yes you. And it's like, all right, well, you're not the guy that I need in this room then, right? Where's your boss at, right? Who can make these commitments? I need them in here. So,
Or the wrong person is moderating the meeting. And
right.
I think about my own experience. My first job was a CB museum up in Port Hueneme, and they had me rolling out what they called at the time this flow and problem prevention process, which is really like an early adaptation of Last Planner. And I spent a week learning this kind of process, and then they threw me into a trailer and had me leading this kind of work stream meeting, and I had no idea what I was talking about. And
Right.
so it was a very ineffective meeting. But you talk about failures. I definitely learned about what I needed to know heading into that meeting the next time.
Yep. That's
Um,
right.
when you and I kind of first met, it was at the U of H Law Center
Hmm.
during kind of the COVID
Yep.
years. What did you learn maybe just through building in that kind of chaos?
Man, that was those were crazy times, right? The amount of requests that
Yeah.
were coming out and the mandates that we were trying to put on the job, I felt like most of the time was just trying to, tread lightly to make sure that everybody was remaining productive and that we
Mm,
weren't getting requests that were too outlandish, and some trade partners were, well, we're not going to work around anybody else, only our crafts, and it's like, well, that's not possible, so we ended up working some nights for a while because other trades were, wanted to come in and do their work at night when there was less people. And then of course you had government restrictions. The owner was putting restrictions on it. It was challenging, and he had to be open. And it was one of those where it was really hard. I've always been a somewhat of a commanding person, and it's like, nope, this is what we're doing. But there were times where we didn't know, right? When COVID
yeah.
first came out, there was a
Yeah.
legitimate concern around, like, man,
100%.
is this, we've all seen the movie Outbreak or something. It's like, holy smokes, are we
Yeah.
heading in that direction? Like, what do we
Right.
do? The first time
Right.
we had a positive guy on the job site, I was like, well, what do I do now? So,
Yeah.
but it didn't take, a few months, and he kind of figured out what was going on. And our company was good about setting policy fairly quickly, to where our field staff wasn't having to just make decisions on their own. That's
Mm,
what was hard, is that, we're a big outfit. We got jobs all across the country, and they were very quick to say, here's the policy. And most of the time it followed the government policy, right? That was,
yeah.
that was coming out from whoever, right? Health department. But and then at some point they would update it. So
Hey guys, if your experience was anything like mine when I was a PM, change orders were kind of a pain. You send the change order, then you spend the next 2 weeks chasing it. Subs are texting you updates. Meanwhile, you have a change order log buried in email. Your spreadsheet doesn't match theirs, and you're just trying to figure out what's actually been approved. Meanwhile, your subs are waiting on answers so they can get paid. The owner doesn't really have the visibility they need into cost exposure, and nobody finds out that the numbers don't reconcile at all until closeout. At which point, everyone suddenly disagrees about everything. That's not a people problem, it's a systems problem. Everybody on the job is working out of their own setup. Your ERP, their spreadsheet, someone else's inbox. Change orders end up getting stuck in the middle of all of it. Well, ClearStory fixes that. It's a shared cloud based change order log where GCs, specialty contractors, and owners all see the same information in real time, which is key. Submit and track their work. GCs stay on top of status. Owners see cost exposure before it becomes a surprise. No more digging through email trying to reconcile the logs at closeout. Just change orders under control, which is a unique concept. Check it out at clearstory.build.
Man, weird times. So buildings in a variety of different verticals seem to be getting more complex and bigger as we go. And so on some of these giant facilities, really long term projects, um, do you approach the startup of those projects a little differently than others? Like, what are those like?
yeah, spend a lot more time focusing on the team on those, and what lines of communication are we going to follow, and that's on really big jobs. The challenge is, how do you maintain those lines of communication? And let me just paint an easy picture of an example for you. If you got a 10-man team, or a 15-person team, and they're in a double wide or a triple wide trailer, and the whole team is in there together, it's easy to have a cohesive team, right? So the superintendent comes in from the field and he's mad about something. He walks in a trailer and throws his hard hat and he's all pissed off. And it's easy for him to go to the PE's office and go, these dang shop drawings are not correct, and the material that showed up doesn't match. And everybody hears it, right? And so everybody's aware that there's a problem. And what you might have is that the guy three doors down or on the other side of the trailer that overheard it goes, "Hey, actually, I just talked to the window guy this morning, because I'm managing his scope, and those embeds needed to move for whatever reason." It's, you have that cohesive environment works. Now take 100-person team, and how do you keep that same line of communication where people aren't working in their own little silos, right? So So on the bigger job or on a smaller job, a PM or a PE might have, 7 or 8 or 9 different scopes, but then there's two other PEs that have the other ones, and they're all either in the same office or next to each other or whatever, and they talk regularly. On a really big job, it's like, well, you're managing one scope the whole time. So the guy that's doing concrete has no idea what the elevator guy's doing or what the window guy's doing. And so how do you have that line of communication? And there's something, I got a really good friend of mine in the industry that's a great guy, and he's very experienced, and he's got a saying, and it's always if everybody's got it, then nobody's got it. And what he means by that is, in those scenarios of let's say I've sent out an email to two people and I say this needs to get done ASAP, blah 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 blah. It's probably going to get done, and one of those two people is going to make sure that it happens. Now, if I send that email out to 25 people and say, "Hey, this is a big problem; it needs to get done," well, when you got 25 people, they all just assume that somebody else is doing it, right? So on really large projects, communication is what's going to sink it. Team cohesiveness and communication. So again, is setting those expectations early, and what that looks like. It looks like a written expectation for your role. You will do these things. You will not do these things. And a lot of meetings just to go over, how do we process the submittal? How do we do this and that, right?
There's some gems in there. Yeah, I think on those big jobs, the mob mentality really takes over in positive and negative ways, right? And midway through my career, I was building data centers in the middle of the country, and yeah, you go from having more oversight in all things to a really narrow scope, and that in itself can be challenging because you can kind of get a little bored on like, okay, I'm the mechanical guy. Like that's great. Like I love duct, but and I think to your point about your ongoing point about culture, the malaise of those jobs can also be an issue, right? There's an excitement generally at the beginning. Hey, this is a big job. This is really important. You got assigned before a specific reason. Maybe you're finding your a new apartment, a new spot, and then fast forward 18 months, and you're still in that job. There's 2 more years left. You miss all the things away from your previous spot if you had to relocate. Um, I think that's another challenge of leadership is how do you keep people engaged throughout a project like that? And I don't know, have you seen any specific ways of doing that?
Well, if you relate it back to the military or something, there's battle fatigue, right?
Mm.
And sometimes guys get in a rut. They've been in the same spot for far too long, or on the same job. Us contractors are nomadic people. We're used to every couple of years and even if you're like Houston, for example, is a ginormous city, and you really don't have to travel, but Houston's also, I don't know, 100 miles from one side to the other.
Yeah.
But every couple of years, you're in a new part of town with a new team, a new set of trade partners, a new owner. So if you have a troublesome project or if you have problems or something, it's pretty easy to, at least have the end in sight. You
Mm.
get on a 4, 5, 6 year project, something like that, man, guys can get kind of wore out. They get battle fatigue. And so as a senior manager, I kind of pay attention to that. And sometimes I got to move folks around. And that's a tough one, right? We're always worried in construction about moving somebody because they've got all the history, they've got all the knowledge, to say, take a superintendent from this area and either move them to a new job or new area is always troublesome, but um, it's troublesome too if he becomes ineffective. So you just got to make those decisions of, is it going to be better or worse to keep them here, right? And it doesn't
Yeah.
always mean you got to stick them on a new project. Maybe you're just moving them to another. If it's a really really big job, you're just moving them to a new area or something, or trying to mix it up. But celebrating victories,
Mm.
celebrating milestones.
Yeah.
When your substantial completion date is 5 years away, it's like holy smokes, but and you can't just go like, well, we got topping out in between, and then that's it. Well, celebrate the other stuff. If you're
Yeah.
digging a huge basement, have a bottoming out party,
There
and
you
then have a
go.
topping out party, and then we're partially dried in, and then we put on a new roof on whatever it is. Celebrate your team.
Mm.
That's another thing that I really admire about my boss. He's been very effective, and he's a big proponent for celebrating regularly, right? Big job we got right now that's been a challenge. It's been a difficult one. They finally finished, drilling out all the piers yesterday, and that doesn't seem like a big deal. If you knew the project, you would understand how big a deal it is. And so
Yeah.
it's a huge deal. I mean, we're like, all right, what are we going to do to celebrate this thing?
Yeah.
So
I love that. Yeah, it's important. I think the thing that also caught me by surprise on these big jobs was just the how you're kind of setting up a little mini city, right? And especially it maybe more true in some of these rural environments where you're building these large data centers. But and with that little city dynamic, you're also picking up on all the different elements of what a city entails. The problems, the challenges, the domestic disputes, and that can always be an interesting kind of layer to it. What as you maybe have looked at the different variety of projects in your career, the big, the small, and everything in between, do you have a preference for like project vertical or project type or yeah, as you look back?
uh, I enjoy the large projects. I enjoy the challenge of them. One thing about construction is that, especially in the construction that we do in commercial, no job's the same. I've never built the same building twice. And so establishing worker satisfaction, and not just for my team but for the trade partners. And I was kind of talking about that earlier when we talked about how do you set the tempo on the job up front, how do you set that culture up front. It's the same thing with that. Hey, do our trade partners, do our craft workers have a good place to take a break? Do we have a dedicated lunch spot for them? When you're doing structures and foundations and stuff, hey, have a nice big canopy that's got fans in it and it's got 5, 6, 10 microwaves over there. Make it a comfortable spot that they can take their PPE off. They can rest. Where are the guys parking at? How are they getting through the gates? Is it a mud hole from the gate to the building? Pour some temporary sidewalks. Establish a good working environment for everybody. And it's the same for our team, right? It's what is the trailer like? Do the guys have a private space they can go make a phone call at? If they, maybe they got a doctor's appointment or something and they phone call with their doctor and they're in a room with three other PEs or in a cubicle, build little phone, booths in your job trailer that people can go inside and have a little bit of privacy. Do you have a decent lunch area for the guys to eat lunch at, right? I mean, all those kind of things, right?
Well, and I think like one of the themes of what, a few different things you're saying, I think I kind of point to other industries talk a lot about, driving value for different stakeholders. And I think often in construction, we think about owner value and we don't necessarily think about the, maybe we'll call it the user experience of the people actually constructing that facility, right? And I think that's what you're saying is I read a book called Unreasonable Hospitality this year, and it's all about this restaurant in New York where they essentially looked at ways in which they could create unreasonable hospitality and these little like delightful moments for their customers. And I think as you look at construction, yeah, there's so many opportunities for that. And I think your holistic perspective on how to not only do that for your team, but also holistically on a site, that all drives to that kind of culture creation and helps them understand like, okay, I'm cared for. This project is cared for. There's a focus on quality. There's intention around everything we're doing. I need to bring my best self to this site, and I think like that's invaluable. That's like passive onboarding that I think is so often missed.
Yep, yep. No, you hit the nail on the head, and I'll take it a step further too. Is that there's also a huge, huge labor shortage, right? The trades are in such high demand, it's unreal. So, you know, we look at it from that direction as well. What makes this job more appealing than others, right? When you've got a project that you're parking, 3 miles away, or you're parking off site and having to get shuttled, and there's no decent place to take breaks at, and the buck hoist is always overloaded because they didn't put enough hoist on the or whatever it is. Nobody wants to work on your job, man. So how do you
Yeah.
make your job more appealing, than other projects and all of that? So but the demand around the craft worker is such a big thing, and it's a regular conversation. So because the work's not slowing down. I mean, there's more work out there than I've ever seen in my career. And there's less labor to do it.
How are how is your experience in the industry? And we'll kind of start to get into tech here in a second. But and what you just said around the labor shortage, is that informing what kind of seeds you're planting with your in your kids' heads around opportunities?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
I got a young son. He's about to turn 10, and he's got a mechanical mind, right? And he's a
yeah,
he's a math whiz. You can't get him to read. I get him to go read, and he's reading a comic book. But when it comes to math, he can't get enough of it, right? So
yeah,
it's like, hey, he's going to be an engineer. That's a good direction for him. But at the same time, it's like, well, be an engineer, but also learn a trade.
yeah,
And you become that much more valuable in it, right? But yeah, 100%, Stephen. And I've got a lot of friends that have kids that are teenagers or in their early 20s, and we went through that phase, and I would say it was probably what, the 90s and into the early 2000s, where if you didn't go to college, you were a loser, right? And it couldn't be further from the truth, man.
yep, yep,
It's and now problem is look, if you're making straight A's and you're a brainiac, yeah, you get your butt into college and get an advanced degree because you've got something special, right? But if you just kind of limp your way through high school and now you're spending 2 years at the local community college and you still don't know what you want to do, like, time out. We need to have a conversation, young man. You know how much plumbers and electricians and elevator
yeah,
mechanics are making? It's
yeah,
insane.
yeah.
So go ahead and go round up $100,000 in debt and student loans and still not know what you want to do, or instantly go start making 60, 70, $80,000 a year, and then go through an apprenticeship program. By the time you get done with that paid apprenticeship program, because employers are paying for it for you, you're turned out as a journeyman, electrician, or whatever, making 100, 120, 150, and the sky's the limit. You mentioned these big data center jobs that are out in the middle of nowhere.
Yep.
Yeah, it might not be ideal to go live in a man camp out in the middle of nowhere. You know how much money those guys are making out there?
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, it's insane. So, and I think it's starting to go in that direction. I really admire guys like Mike Rowe, right? He's
mm,
done a fantastic job of promoting the trades. And my dad's an electrician. My grandfather was an iron worker. So I grew up around tradesmen, and I have a deep respect and admiration for guys that learn a skill. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think not even to mention the kind of resiliency to AI disruption for having a hard skill, right? And I think my family moved from Chicago to kind of central Virginia, right outside Richmond, about 5 years ago. And I think I went to school. A lot of my friends from school were in kind of finance and kind of fintech, and then moving into an area like this. Now a lot of my friends are craftsmen and master carpenters, and it's incredible to see like what they can build with their hands, right? And what they can do. And I think one of the things I've enjoyed is being able to have my boys go into a workshop with one of my buddies, and they'll teach them how to build, right? And I think, yeah, I think the opportunities are endless for folks to take that path, because ultimately, like your son, engineering mindset, learns a skill with AI. He might have his own vertically integrated general contracting business with an overhead of two people, and he's doing 500 million like a year. Like there's just a lot of opportunities now with the technologies we have, but the core is, do you have domain expertise? Do you have some hard skills that you can layer into how these tools are being deployed? So I do love that message. When we talk about tech, I think our first conversation, one of the things I appreciated about your perspective was we talked about the promise of tech, and maybe the delta between the promise and the actuality of, hey, tech is going to give a lot of your time back, and it's going to help you manage more while doing less. And one of the points was like, it's not really doing that yet. And maybe a year on from that conversation, what's your perspective now? Where are things landing? Where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, like anything else, the tech improves over time, and it's one of those when the first new widget or new software or new idea comes out, it's maybe not hasn't been fully vetted in the field yet, or it's still it requires a larger device that's not easy to take to the field, and all those things. Well, and that improves over time, and so I'm starting to see that now, right? I mean, I've got superintendents in the field that have, and man, I'm ignorant to it, so I'm sorry, but whatever software it is on their iPad where they're literally walking around holding it up inside the building at the BIM model and identifying, clashes firsthand of stuff that's not installed yet, right? Some of the doxel systems that are out there, it's starting to come into play, and I am starting to see it in the field right now. Have we cut back durations on work activities? Not really. Maybe a little bit. Prefab is the big thing, is the big buzzword now. We got a lot of projects that are doing that, and we can talk more about that in a second. But I haven't quite seen the breakdown or the cutback in durations, but the go backs and the rework is what's being saved, right? And those are those unplanned durations on your schedule that's going to hurt you, right? And those are the ones that lead to quality issues, that lead to safety issues. You're now stacking trades, and things aren't going as well. Being able to identify clashes early. BIM modeling is still probably one of the biggest advancements, and that I've watched in my career. From when I first came out 20 years ago, we were still overlaying butter paper on top of shop drawings and coordinating that way, to now materials getting unloaded off the truck, already fabricated pieces of pipe with the spools welded to it and flanges and everything else, and we're just sticking it up there and hanging it, and poof, everything fits, right? There's robots that drive around now drilling anchors in the deck if you give it the right, some of the dusty robotics and the layout equipment and all of this stuff. We are starting to see it in the field, and it's pretty awesome.
Has that required its own uh, kind of education? Just in terms of like we talked about the value of the analog in how it kind of allows us to use our own mental muscles to learn, but also learning all these new tools is I can imagine a challenge. How do you handle that from a regional kind of a management standpoint?
Yeah, it's funny. You'll see it on the job now because there's still some of those old school guys that were around before any of that stuff existed.
Yeah.
And when that kind of, I'll just stereotype people for a second, right? But when that nerdy dude comes out, that his vest is kind of hanging off of him, and
Very large. It's like an extra large.
yeah, right. And he's got whatever instrument in his hand that's going to help, and it's like everybody used to laugh at those guys, but now I'm watching these like really old school, callous hand iron workers that are the
Yeah.
toughest guys on the job, just waiting for this nerd to give them the information, and they're so enthralled of what
Yeah.
information he's able to do, and they're like, I need this guy, and so it's kind of cool, right? And we're starting to watch the industry embrace it. Like I said, the craftsmen in the field are really starting to embrace it, but bridging that gap, just like you said, between that old school iron worker knows you can't do this because he's experienced it and whatever else. That nerd that's got the biggest toolbox ever of, hey, we need to lift this piece and then this piece, and it's going to go and go in better, and he can already identify the center of gravity of the next pick that's coming, or whatever it happens to be, right?
Yeah.
But he doesn't have the experience that guy has, and watching those two work together is great, and so I hope that it kind of stays that way, right? But are the guys still learning the fundamentals? I think so.
Yeah.
I think they are. And some of these technologies that we're using now that we think is going to ruin people's understanding of the fundamentals, they're not going away, right? So back to my example, can you still do long division, Stephen?
It's funny you
I've
asked that. My son was going through some like pretty large word problems. He's 8,
yeah.
and when we were doing like long subtraction, long addition, and for a moment I was like, hold on, like do we carry the one?
Right.
So
And that's what I'm getting is that, there were comments back then that's like, what are you going to do if you don't have a calculator?
yeah,
I, I can't recall a time where I needed to make a mathematical equation that like something was riding on and I didn't have a
yeah,
calculator,
yeah.
right? So, um, is losing these things really a big deal? I mean, how many people know how to go out and harvest wheat and turn it into bread? Like nobody, right? And maybe 100 years ago, when a factory started producing, when the sunbeam first started, people were going, "Y'all are going to starve to death because you don't know how to do this anymore." And not really.
I think the thing we will miss if we lose is the thing that is really the hardest to digitize, which is like the stuff inside your brain, right? And like there's you talk about these models and there's like a trillion parameters, which is like unbelievable. And I'm gonna get these numbers wrong, but I was listening to a podcast and it talked about like the brain processes 100 trillion parameters like really quickly. And so there's things that we're able to do that is still net more impressive than at least where some of these models are at. And the point I'm making is like, do you record your interactions in the field or like store those transcripts in a way that you're going to be able to leverage later?
No, not really. And
Please
should
do,
we?
Wes. I
It,
think
it,
I think we need you to do that
yeah,
for humanity.
but it's one of those too that's back to my comment earlier around some lessons just have to be learned the hard way. Some things just have to be learned through experience. And we talk about that, internally within our company, we've got a lot of different platforms on our website, on our intranet, that training modules, and we're going and tapping on these old school superintendents. We've got a guy that's built, multiple stadiums. And so he knows a whole lot about precast direction and stadiums and stuff like that. And he's very knowledgeable. And we're always trying to go, how do we harness his information and put it into a platform that we can share it with the young guys? And there is good that comes out of that. And some of that information does get passed down through some of those platforms, but it's not as much as you would hope for, right? So to think that you could go to somebody that says, I've never poured a pan deck, right? I've never formed a pan deck before, a slab, and I can give him a book with all of Wes's, experience and elevated concrete forming, and like, oh, he now knows everything Wes knows. Like that, it doesn't work that way. You still just have to have a little trial by fire, right?
I agree, but I think you do need to think about your digital brain. Like I think if you fast forward, like Elon wants to start making 1 million humanoids a year, and so there's going to be some use cases for these things. So imagine like 3 years from now, we are still in the same kind of shortage from a labor standpoint, and you start seeing one or two humanoids showing up in your job site, and maybe one is helping to set forms. They need data to understand the dynamics of a job site. And so it's not necessarily like what is the best way to set a form. It is, okay, I'm interacting with this job site. How do job sites operate? Right? And so I think not that I want to teach all these little humanoids all of our tricks and ways. But even from just a value positioning for yourself, I think I've told a number of my superintendent buddies this, like record everything legally that you can, and ensure that you have personal access to those transcripts, and like use Claude Code to build a digital brain. And I do this. I do this for this podcast. I built a little it's called a little podcast brain skill in Claude, and it leveraged the 39 or so transcripts of the episodes we've already had, and I use that to say I kind of it understands the audience of who listens, and I will ask it where are the gaps in questions that I haven't asked, and it'll help train me on trying to be a better maybe host. So I think there's some opportunities there, and but I know there's some challenges around how you record kind of project interactions.
Right. Yeah. No, no, that's really interesting. Using something like that, and I think if that grows widespread in the industry, I think you're going to run into. Unfortunately, our world's full of lawyers and bankers, and at some point you'll run into hey, this is copyrighted. This is proprietary information. So it's it's how are we using that information and what are we using it for? But I mean, I'm excited to see what comes out of it. Right, right now AI is already starting to change the game. had a young guy on a job take a spec section that was, I don't know, 38 pages long and upload it into whatever software he was using. And, it printed out a pre-install meeting minutes like that. And I skimmed through it and I was like, dude, this is almost perfect. Like
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
but it's funny talking about new, we say that AI takes away jobs. It also creates new ones too, right? And like
Mm.
knowing how to prompt AI to do the things that you're saying is going to be a new skill, right?
Yeah. 100%.
So,
Um, so maybe zooming out a little bit, if you could go back to your first day as a superintendent, what is one thing you would tell yourself about leading a project that you had to learn the hard way?
I would say humility, and what I mean by that is you don't have to know everything, and you can ask questions. I remember early on in my career, I took it very personal, and it wasn't out of pride necessarily. It was about that I wanted to be the best. And so when I didn't know something, it would really bother me, right? And there was a lot of situations that I screwed up or I made the wrong call on or something because I was too afraid to ask for more information because I felt like, well, I'm the guy running the show. I've got to know what to do, and having that sense of self awareness of it's okay to be like, I don't know what you just asked me. I don't have a clue what that means. Tell me more about that, right? To think that you can walk onto a job at, I don't know, 25 years old and know everything there is to know about how a building goes together is so stupid, right? It's unreal. And so, hey man, ask questions, dude. Be a sponge. And it's easier than ever now. We're just sitting here talking about technology, right? On the first several years, I had the old school brick Nextel with Direct Connect, and that was my phone. BlackBerry didn't come out until I was 4 or 5 years, working already. And now we've got these things, these cell phones that are just ridiculous. These computers at your fingertips that are connected to everything you would ever want to know, right? So you should never be making an uninformed decision, is what I'm getting at, right? And if you're uninformed, then become informed, and spare yourself a little bit of heartache because I caused myself plenty. So,
That's invaluable. Well, Wes, appreciate it, man. This was good. I feel like
yeah,
you're
man,
someone that I always enjoy chatting with, so I appreciate you making time.
absolutely, Stephen. Thank you. Appreciate it.